We're in Acts, the 22nd chapter, and last week, if memory serves me right, we ended with verse 22, and we remember that Paul has been taken by the Romans from the riot in the temple that had taken place because Paul was there, simply because he was there. That was it. And false charges were made against him. The riot started, and the soldiers came down from the castle, the fortification that they had above the temple, and took care of it by taking Paul into custody, so to speak. And I want to mention something here because we'll notice it later, and it was not illegal for a Roman citizen to be bound, that is, to have shackles put upon him as we would think of them. What was illegal for a Roman was to be bound in such a way as to punish him in some way. And we're going to see that play out a little bit later. But we notice that we remember that Paul had asked for permission to speak to the people. The centurion of centurions gave him that permission, and he began speaking. And everything was fine. The people quieted down. They heard him. They listened to him. And one of the reasons was because he spoke to them in their own language. And I guess they were just as surprised that he spoke to them in that language as the chief centurion had been that he spoke Greek. And so whatever the case is, they allowed him to speak, and he's going along, and everything's fine, and then he says one word: Gentiles. And what happened? That's where we pick up with verse 23 and 24. And as they cried out, the Jews, and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore he cried, or wherefore they cried so against him. So as they cried out, the first thing we notice is they cast off their clothing, that is the outer garment, and they're throwing dust into the air. Why did they do that? They're acting like madmen. But the reason is because that's the way they publicly showed grief and anger in public. And so the chief captain, he had thought maybe he'll learn something about the charges made against Paul, but he didn't learn anything. And so what did he do? They were rioting again, or threatening at least a riot. So the chief captain commanded for Paul to be put in or brought into the castle. And he commanded that he be examined by scourging. Scourging was something that was done in old times, thinking that, sometimes they use it as a punishment, period. Sometimes they use it and they thought, well, if we torture this guy enough, then he'll finally admit to what he did. Well, what usually happened in cases like that is they'd torture the guy until he just couldn't stand it anymore, and then he'd tell them whatever they wanted him to say. That's been a tactic too that has been used in the past by law enforcement in the United States. We don't think of that too often, but before certain laws were passed to prohibit that kind of thing, police officers would use every means available to them, including keeping the guy up for hours and days even, and questioning him constantly all the time. And when a person goes through that, eventually they begin to lose contact with sanity, and they will begin to say whatever they think wants to be heard, just to get it to end. Our military has used it for years. Used to be waterboarding was done. And what that is a wet cloth is put over the face of the person, over his eyes and everything, so he can't see, and then water is dripped or poured over it, and it will cause a person to think that they're drowning. They won't, but it causes them to think so. They begin to choke and etc. Well, those kinds of things really ought not to go on. I think there are better ways to find out information, but be that as it may, Lysias couldn't determine the charges that had been brought against or made against Paul by the Jews before he got there, so he figures, I'll just beat the information out of Paul. Well, this doesn't work. It will cause someone to confess to something they didn't do. And over the years, again, looking at law enforcement, we've seen time after time where people have been adjudicated of the crime that they were accused of years later because of DNA testing, either because the confession that the man made was kind of forced out of him, or something of that nature, or maybe the evidence was all circumstantial, but it gave the people the idea he did it. So I want to look at a description with you of what scourging was by a man named Reese, who has written a decent commentary on the book of Acts. And he said the Roman scourge, the flagellum, was a fearful instrument of torture. He said it consisted of 3 to 9 strands of leather thongs, weighted with pieces of metal and attached to a stout wooden handle. The person to be scourged was stripped to the waist and then tied with leather thongs either to a stooping position over a short post or suspended by the hands above the ground. He said men were known to have their eyeballs gouged out by the metal ends of the thongs. In other words, they didn't just beat them on the back. In fact, one of the things I read showed that a really skilled scourger could take this scourge with long enough thongs and wrap it when he hit the fella in the back around his chest area, and then of course with it weighted with metal pieces, he'd jerk it back, and so what it would do is just rip all across the chest and abdomen and wherever he hit him with it, and then across the back as well. He went on to say the metal ends of the thongs or to have their abdomens torn open during the brutal lashings. Tacitus, that's a Roman historian, tells us that in such beatings, 7 out of 10 men died, literally beaten to death. He said the other 3 were carried out on a stretcher, and most remained cripples for the rest of their lives. So this was no small thing that was being threatened to be done by Paul or to Paul on this occasion. And when we think about it, this was the way Jesus was beaten. And no wonder then that he had trouble carrying the cross all the way to Golgotha. I had to get somebody else to help. A centurion would be in charge of the scourging, not the chief centurion, but he ordered it, and another centurion would be in charge of this. And so consider that the soldiers, when they prepared Paul for this scourging, have you ever thought about what they would have seen? As they stripped him off to the waist and looked at his body, have you ever thought about what they would have been seeing? Because the Corinthian letter gives us a lot of information on the things that Paul had gone through, stonings and beatings and all kinds of things. And the Corinthian letter was written approximately 2 years before the time that we're looking at right now. And so he had written them a letter, and he described all kinds of things that he'd gone through. You would have seen a man with scars all over him, possibly scars on his face as well, because remember, a stoning, those stones, a lot of those folks weren't real accurate with it, and they're just throwing those stones just to hit him anywhere. He would have been covered in scars. There's no way a man could go through the beatings that he described in the Corinthian letter, the stoning and all of those things, without having tremendous scars. Consider one word caused all of this commotion. Just one word. Just one word caused Adam and Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit. Satan repeated what God said, except he said not. Someone once said that's the knot in the devil's tail. And it's true. He told one word that changed everything. And one word in this case changed everything. The Jews from going to listening politely, maybe thinking about what he was saying. You can almost hear them saying, amen, as he made his points, until one word, that hated word, Gentile. You know, we have a word in our time that's just almost hated as bad as that. And it's the word slaves. People will get all upset, bent out of shape, even cause riots if a person uses that word in the wrong way or they're perceived wrong way. But it's interesting to me that you and I are called slaves over and over and over and over again in the Scriptures. We are God's slave. We are Christ's slave. And as Christians, we ought not to be afraid of that word. We ought to use it correctly in its context to show people that a slave was a person who had to obey his master's voice no matter what. And we have a master in heaven. And we are to obey his voice no matter what he says, even if we don't understand it at the time, even if we don't understand the reason. Acts 22 and verse 25, notice what's said now. And as these soldiers bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. Paul stops them with just one question. Is it lawful? Can you scourge a man who's a Roman, obvious citizen, and uncondemned? Let's note two things here about the Roman law. Roman law declared if you claimed to be a Roman citizen and it was found that you were not, that was a death sentence. So it wasn't taken lightly for someone to say, I am a Roman citizen. He knew that if he was not, he was courting an automatic death sentence. And it should have been that the centurion would not have questioned Paul's citizenship. Why? Because he did know already that Paul, was a citizen of Tarsus, a free city, a citizen city. This centurion runs to the chief of centurions. And second, it's illegal to bind and beat a Roman citizen by Roman law. The key is bind and beat. Bind how? Not by shackles. They could do that to a Roman citizen, but they couldn't bind him in such a way that they would then go ahead and punish him or beat him or scourging him. That was illegal. Jackson recorded that in earlier Roman law, it forbade the beating of a Roman citizen. He quotes a Roman historian, Livy, but later on the system allowed that a citizen might be flogged provided he had enjoyed the benefit of a trial. So notice what we learn from the historians, that a man could be beaten, flogged, scourged, but only a Roman citizen, only if that citizen had had a trial and the verdict had gone against him, obviously. We're going to see in the next 3 verses how unsettling Paul's claim of Roman citizenship really was to these soldiers. Look at verses 27 through 29 with me. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn. Then straightway they departed from him which should have examined him, and the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. The centurion of centurions is immediately sent for, and he immediately drops whatever he's done. And he goes to see Paul. Are you really a Roman? That's the way we would say it today. Are you really a Roman citizen? There were 3 ways that a person could become a Roman citizen in that time. He could buy his citizenship at a great cost. The centurion of centurions had done that, and he points it out in this text. The second way was bestowed because of some great service that had been done to or for the Roman Empire. Maybe a commander of some foreign force that helped the Romans out when they were really needing it and helped them win a battle. That could give a man Roman citizenship. It could be granted to him by a Caesar. And the third way was to be born a Roman citizen, either an Italian to begin with, a Roman citizen born in that family, or one who was born in a city that was declared a citizen city. And so this is what this man is asking. Are you really a Roman citizen? And he's really wanting to know, well, how did you become a Roman citizen? That's involved with his statement, I bought my citizenship with a great sum of money. The word freedom here is interesting because it means, Strong tells us, it means simply citizenship in the original Greek, politeia. And the Thayer tells us it's a citizenship with the rights of a citizen. I'm not sure if there's a real distinction of a citizen without the rights of a citizen, but be that as it may, it shows us this word freedom means I bought my citizenship, the centurion is saying. Now, watch the reaction to Paul's declaration that he was free-born, citizen-born. Watch the reaction. I was citizen-born. And straightway, immediately we would say, what did those who were tasked with examining him by scourging him to do? They departed from him. Can't you just imagine the picture in your mind? Oh, they're getting ready. They've maybe tied him all to the post already and getting ready, and he asked them that question. And now they find out he was a free-born citizen. You ever turn a light on in the middle of the kitchen at night when you know you got cockroaches around? You ever see them? That light, man, it comes on and they're gone. That's the picture we should get here. They were scared. Well, why would they be so scared? They hadn't scourged him yet. Because just to bind him for the purpose of scourging would mean that they themselves, once he was declared to be a Roman citizen, would have been scourged in the same way that he would have been. Immediately they got away from him. They don't want anything to do with Paul. They don't want anyone to even really know that they were there. Consider for just a moment why God had not chosen any of the original 12 to go to the Gentiles. Have you ever thought about that? You see, they were all Jewish citizens. None of them had Roman citizenship. They were Hebrews. But Paul not only was had a Jewish heritage, but he also was a Roman citizen, freeborn. And that gave him certain rights and privileges that none of the original 12 had. They didn't have the rights and freedoms and privileges that he had as a Roman citizen. And he uses those advantages a number of times. He uses it to keep from being beaten on this occasion, unjustly beaten. He used it before others as well. He used his privilege. He'll use it in the future with regard to Felix. Look at verse 30 of our text. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands. Notice he is in bands now, but not the thongs that were used to then punish him. He was accused of the Jews. He loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priest and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. The verse confirms that the centurion still did not know why the Jews had attacked Paul. He had no idea. And so the centurion is really kind of what we call between a rock and a hard place. He can't do certain things because it would upset one group. If he did the other things, it would upset the Roman authorities. If Paul was a criminal and then he let him go, if the Jews really did know that he was a criminal and really were right in trying to attack him, and the centurion let him go, then the centurion was going to be in trouble. He's going to be in trouble with the Jews. He's going to be in trouble with the Romans. Why? Because they've already demonstrated they want to kill him. So if they get their hands on him, they're going to kill him. On the other hand, if he let Paul go and the Jews killed this Roman citizen, then he was in trouble with the Romans. So he's in a place where either way he goes, by his own authority, he's going to be in trouble. Under these circumstances, he did the only thing that he could. He called for the chief priest, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin to meet with him and Paul at the temple. Interestingly, he will be stymied again in his search for knowledge as to why the Jews want to kill Paul, why they had rioted. Look at verse 1 of chapter 23. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Paul did what? He earnestly beheld the council. The American Standard renders this, looking steadfastly on the council. One version that I noticed said that he stared at them. He just really intently looked at them. The Living Oracles by Campbell says he looked attentively on the Sanhedrin. This term, earnestly beholding, it means to gaze intently. He is looking at them just as intent as he can possibly be. I don't believe he made an ugly face like I probably just did, but he's really giving them the stare down, so to speak. Thayer tells us it means to fix his eyes on them. Why? Jackson said it was a riveting gaze. We might think of this as staring intently at someone, causing them to maybe even look away because they're ashamed. Or it could be that he caused them to look back at him in the same kind of way. He's challenging them, apparently, with his eyes. Do we remember another time when eyes caused someone to repent? Remember Peter as he sat outside the trials of Jesus? And the scriptures tell us that after he had denied him the third time, what did Jesus do? He turned and looked at Peter. The eyes can show a lot of different emotions. It can cause people to realize they're in the wrong. And Jesus' eyes on Peter showed him, you're wrong. You did exactly what I said you would do, even though you denied vehemently. You would not betray me. You would not denounce me. And yet that's what Peter did. Notice then that it says men and brethren. The American Standard Version and the Living Oracles, they do not have the word men here. And either way, I don't think it shows too much difference, because it's showing respect. He used a term that would show, he used brethren. He recognized them as heritage. I'm from the same heritage you are. I am a Jew, born of a Jewish parents in this free city of Tarsus. He reminded them, spoke to them in respect. He addressed them as being from the same family tree, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom the Jews were so proud of that heritage. He could say, I'm proud to have been from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And notice the word council. That's the Sanhedrin. It's referring to the Sanhedrin. He said, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. I have lived to behave as a citizen from the original. I have behaved as a good citizen. I have lived the life of a proper citizen. I have even to this day lived in all good conscience toward God, the Living Oracles. Good, agathos. Good, well, Strong says. Thayer tells us that it means of a good constitution or nature. That which is excellent, that which is distinguished, that which is upright and honorable. To whom, before whom had Paul lived in this upright and honorable way of life? It was before God, wasn't it? Notice he didn't say, I've lived this way in all good conscience before you, Sanhedrin, high priest. The word conscience means a co-perception. I find that interesting. Strong defined that synodesis as being co-perception. That is his moral conscience. But co signifies someone else, not just yourself. Co-perception. My perception, I believe he's saying, is correct, not just because I have that perception of myself, but God has that perception of me as well. Thayer tells us that this original word for conscience means the soul is distinguishing between what is morally good and bad, prompting us to do the former, that is, what is good, morally good, and shun the latter, commending the one, condemning the other. Paul is saying, I have always had a good conscience. In other words, I have never done anything that my conscience said was bad. I have never done anything that my conscience says is evil. The conscience often depends on two things. First of all, how the conscience has been taught, how we have been taught. A headhunter, for instance, his conscience doesn't bother him when he kills his enemy and then eats him. Why? Because he's been taught from the day he was born, it's all right. And you'll gain strength and courage and whatever from killing your enemy and eating him. The Christian conscience couldn't do that because our conscience has been taught that it's wrong to murder someone. Our conscience has been taught through all the principles of the Scripture that it'd be wrong to eat that other human being. And of course, the second part of that is whether or not we accept the good moral teaching that we've received or whether we reject that moral teaching. Paul is saying, I had correct moral teaching. He'd already told them that he had sat at the feet of the greatest Jewish teacher that they had ever had, Gamaliel. And Gamaliel's teaching would show him everything that was morally right and everything that was morally wrong. And so he said, I have lived in all good conscience. And notice something. That phrase is in the perfect past tense. He has all of his past actions have resulted in what he's saying in the present condition that he's in. Well, wait a minute. Paul isn't saying that he had never done anything wrong. That's not what he's saying. Paul is saying that he never did anything that was morally wrong by violating his conscience. He never did it. He never did that thing. But wait a minute, someone says, didn't Paul condone the stoning of Stephen? Yeah. Didn't he give his consent? In other words, he was an authority of some kind that allowed those people to know we're doing this by the authority of the Sanhedrin. He was an officer of the Sanhedrin. And what did he do that showed that he condoned and gave that authority? He held the clothes of those who stoned Stephen. How could he say, now, many years later, as a Christian, I never did anything that violated my conscience. I never did anything that I knew was morally wrong. Because at the time, he thought he was obeying God's commands. At the time Stephen was stoned, he wasn't violating his conscience. His conscience told him this is the absolute right thing to do. Again, Paul was not saying that he never did anything that was wrong. We know that to be the case by just looking at one verse, 1 Timothy 1 and verse 15. He said, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Literally, that would be, of whom I chief. I'm the chief one that he came to save or to die for. Now, we understand what he's saying, relatively speaking. Note that Paul lets us know that there's a big difference between having a good conscience, that is, thinking what we're doing right, and being sinless. Many people, religious people today, they feel like, oh, I'm doing right when they're actually doing wrong. Oh, it's right for me. I just feel that it's right for me to have that piano playing, and that orchestra or band or whatever you want to call it is playing while I'm being entertained by a quartet or chorus. Many religious people feel like they're doing right. Their conscience doesn't bother them for what they're doing, but they're wrong. Luttrell made this statement here. He said, if just doing what you think is right would save, listen to him, Paul would have been a saved man even while persecuting Christ and his church. Let me say that again. If just doing what you think is right would save, Paul would have been a saved man even while persecuting Christ and his church. But having a good conscience, thinking that we're doing what's right, doesn't mean that we're right. Stringer also said something I found interesting. He said, the conscience does not determine what is right and what is wrong. It prompts us to act in accordance with whatever standard of right and wrong we accept. The headhunter thinks he's right. He's not. He's got the wrong standard. Paul had a good conscience. He had followed the law of Moses to the very best that he knew how. He never violated his conscience as he strove to follow the law of Moses under which he lived for most of his life. A good conscience alone will not justify any of us. Well, let's think about the reaction then to Paul's words. Look at verse 2. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. The high priest, Ananias, he issues this command to strike Paul, knock him in the teeth, slap him down. Who was this Ananias? Was he a legitimate high priest? According to Josephus, Jonathan was the legitimate high priest during this time. Well, why wasn't Ananias the legitimate high priest? In order to be the legitimate high priest, it had to be someone from a particular family of the Levites. And thus, it had to be someone who was appointed by God to be the high priest. Luttrell tells us that Herod appointed this man, Ananias, to be the high priest, a political high priest, around 47 or 48 AD. What we're seeing here is about 58 AD, if memory serves me correctly, in our text. This man had served as a high priest not because God chose him, but because the Roman authorities chose him. And why did the Roman authorities choose him? They'd been doing this for quite some time. They were appointing men who favored Roman politics, who favored Roman law, who favored the way Romans would do something. And so there were actually two high priests serving at the same time. The gospel records show us that there were two high priests serving at the same time. One who was God's chosen high priest, and one who was a political high priest, doing the will of the Roman government. Some say that Herod wasn't the one who promoted this man to be high priest, but it was one of his near relatives that appointed him. I don't know which is the case. I haven't seen enough evidence either way. Nevertheless, he was appointed by Roman authority. Let's ask another question. What kind of a man was Ananias? Listen to what Roper says. He said, according to historians, Ananias the high priest was one of the most ungodly and unscrupulous ever to hold that position. He stole tithes from his own priests to make himself richer and had people murdered so that he could stay in power. He was notorious as a glutton, a thief, a rapacious robber, and a quisling in the Roman service. Quisling is one who bows to their will. Luttrell tells us that he was killed about 10 years after the time of our text. That would make it around 68 AD. Maybe just 69, maybe just a little later or earlier. Think about that. He was killed by some of the dagger men, remember them, the zealots, who carried daggers and would assassinate people who were favorable to the Romans. And historians tell us that that's who killed him, and because he favored the Romans. And notice the time period in there. The actual rebellion that led to the Romans attacking Jerusalem and finally destroying it began in, you ready? 68 AD. That's when the Romans said, enough's enough, and began to start destroying the Hebrew people. When was he killed by the Zealots? 68 AD. It fits, doesn't it? Why would Ananias command those who were near Paul to smite him, smack him in the mouth? Did he think that Paul maybe was saying that he had never done anything wrong? Well, that would be an offense that would be worth some kind of punishment, wouldn't it? Could it have been because of a guilty conscience on his part, because he was so full of sin? This is a very wicked man. Almost every single commentator that I read about Ananias showed just what a horrible individual he does, murder and theft and just anything. If he thought he could get away with it, he did it to maintain power and to make himself rich. And did he give this order because he thought maybe that Paul really was speaking against the temple, against the law, and against the Jews as a whole, therefore a traitor to his heritage? We don't know what all the reasons were. We simply know that he commanded him to be beaten, to be struck in the mouth by those who were standing near. Next week, let's come back and let's notice the reaction of Paul to being smitten in the mouth by the order of this very, very evil so-called high priest.